What's up, guys? I'm Chris Spags here, back with another Four Corners video for today's 7-game NBA slate, courtesy of Awesemo.com. It's looking like it's going to be an interesting slate full of high-scoring games, really weird chalk choices, and also some really bad-looking ones. So like this video right now, and leave a comment down below. Tell me which guy you like the most amidst this chaotic-looking Friday slate. I'll jump into the comments later and talk with you guys, but let's keep it going. Let's keep the energy up, because I need it for this particular NBA slate. The first corner I want to hit on is a game with the Nets visiting the Lakers. This one is a 230.5 point combined total, which is a slate high, and it represents a 4.2 point boost for Brooklyn and a 3-point boost for the Lakers. It's a revenge game for D'Angelo Russell, and he's had 77 fantasy points and 58.25 fantasy points in his last 2 games versus Sacramento and the Clippers. He's also had at least 25 shots in his last 3 games. It's clearly his team right now. It's a revenge spot, as I mentioned, and I think this all bodes well for D'Angelo Russell at just 15% ownership projected right now. I would think that number goes up a little bit as we go, but for me right now, with where we're projecting Russell's ownership, I want a lot more of that. And even though Russell's looked as good as gold recently, there are some viable pivots to him. Spencer Dinwiddie and Karis LeVert in particular are 2 guys who could take the ball handling and usage away from Russell. I don't think they will in the spot, but I think they still could have enough value on their own. It's a pace-up spot versus a Lakers team who defensively is not looking pretty good. So I don't have an issue with LeVert or Dinwiddie, especially because they did just lose minutes last game to a crunch time bench group who did bring the Nets back versus Sacramento. It's a nice rebounding spot for both Jarrett Allen and Ed Davis. Both guys' minutes are pretty fungible. Jarrett Allen lost crunch time minutes as well in that game. Ed Davis just not really spiking a ton of more minutes and not taking away a lot from Jarrett Allen either. So these guys look okay. It should be a good spot for them, but I don't know that either is really going to get guaranteed enough run to really have an upside day being worthy of being in your tournament lineups. LeBron James' price being down makes him playable despite the minutes restriction on him right now. He's going to be under 10% owned. He still does have some decent upside, so I don't mind LeBron James. He's been posting a 40% usage rate in games since his minutes restriction was announced. Kyle Kuzma had 43.25 fantasy points the last time he played Brooklyn. He did shoot 21 times that game, and he really hasn't been shooting that much, even in games without LeBron. But Kyle Kuzma's in an okay spot here. He hasn't shown much upside recently, but I don't hate him given his price being reasonable and the fact that we do have a pretty big Vegas total here on a day in which there aren't a lot of great Vegas totals. Rajon Rondo had 7% usage last time that LeBron was in the lineup. I really don't love Rondo here. The Nets close out on shooters pretty well, so you should see Rondo's assist upside cut into a bit. Rondo's an okay play. You can get there, but he's not a guy I'm trying to force into lineups because I do think the ball handling time that LeBron takes away from him does hurt him a bit. The 16% ownership for JaVale McGee seems fair. He's been playing upwards of 30 minutes recently, and the Nets are also a pretty bad rebounding squad, so you could see McGee have a nice day. And last but not least, on the Lakers side, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope put up 50.25 fantasy points versus the Bucks. There was a symptom of both their defense and just there being nobody else on the court who could do anything remotely useful. So I think it's a spot here where Kentavious Caldwell-Pope could get there again. He's playing for a contract right now, so that is noteworthy, but I don't think he's going to have that much upside, and I'm not dying to get to him in a day where his price is up and LeBron is back. The next corner I want to hit on is a game with the Clippers visiting the Cavs. This one is a 228 point combined total, which represents a 6.7 point boost for the Clippers and a 2.9 point boost for Cleveland. Danilo Gallinari is averaging 41.2 fantasy points over his last 5 games. He's also been shooting 17 shots in most of those games as well, so it's a good spot for Danilo Gallinari versus a Cavs team who's going to give up a pretty generous field goal percentage. I know I don't mind Gallo at all tonight, even though the price coming up does make him a little bit less appealing. Patrick Beverley's been over 31.5 fantasy points in 2 out of his last 3 games, and the matchup versus Colin Sexton could give him some turnover upside, so I don't mind him here, though he's another guy who it's hard to see him having that tournament ceiling that you really need. Montrezl Harrell has had over 42.25 fantasy points in his last 4 games, and he's been cutting into Lou Williams' usage opportunity a bit. Right now, we have Lou Williams projected for about double the ownership, so I would prefer to keep going with Harrell right now, riding the hot hand. But if that ownership did shift, I'd be willing to go to Lou Williams, and let's say if Harrell were double his ownership, I think it's a spot where Lou Williams could have that bounce back day. But for right now, I think it seems like it's Harrell's role in the second unit. Landry Shamet's an interesting value play on a day in which we're going to have a lot of potentially bad chalk out there. The Cavs do give up a very generous field goal percentage from deep, and Landry Shamet can shoot up to 10, 12 times from deep in a game, so he is a guy who could get there. Kevin Love has a nice matchup, but his illnesses, his back issues, all that stuff make me worry a little bit about him. He did leave in the third quarter in the last game for the Cavs. It's a spot where you could see him leave again. It worries me enough to not want a ton of him, but he does have a lot of upside, a really poor rebounding Clippers team on the other side. Larry Nance had 31.25 fantasy points as return to the lineup versus Milwaukee. He played just 23 minutes, and some of that actually might have been a little higher because of Kevin Love going out in the third quarter pretty early. So it's a spot where I'd like Larry Nance a little bit, but I think it might be tough for him to get enough minutes to have the value that you need for him to be viable in a tournament. Cedi Osman lost some minutes last game with all the guys returning to the rotation, so it could be a spot where he's not going to have the same reliability he's had recently. recently where he's been in the mid 30s, high 30s fantasy points pretty much every game. So I don't mind Chetty here, but if he's only playing 30 minutes, he does become substantially riskier. And Jordan Clarkson's price is low enough to be worthwhile. The fact that Colin Sexton's price is rising, he's been very steady, he's been very good, but he's a points dependent guy. Not that Jordan Clarkson isn't points dependent, but he's a cheaper points dependent guy. So I don't mind Jordan Clarkson here. I think Colin Sexton a little bit less appealing now that his price is up to where probably it should be. The next corner I want to hit on is a game with the Grizzlies visiting the Magic. This one has a 207-point combined total, which represents a 2.1-point boost for Orlando and a 3.5-point drop for Memphis. Delon Wright's projected for 39% ownership with Mike Conley out, and he's been pretty good in court time without Mike Conley and Avery Bradley, two guys who are out today. He's been 0.92 fantasy points per minute, which is right where you need him to be. I think he's an interesting value-ish guy. His price isn't low enough where he's a smash play. Might want to get away from it a little bit in tournaments, but overall, he looks like a pretty steady play. Tyler Dorsey currently has a slate high 51% ownership projected, as he's also going to likely pick up some minutes with both Conley and Bradley out. I don't mind him. He's very cheap, but I think you're going to have a hard time seeing him spike that ceiling. Magic defense pretty good. Dorsey also not that great of a permanent player, so I don't mind him, but I think I might want to find value elsewhere at a decent percentage. Justin Holiday will also see some more usage, but given what we know of him, I think the 17% ownership projected for him seems a bit high. Jonas Valanciunas too, 33% ownership feels a little high, though you could justify that because he's at least a good player. These guys are okay, but I don't know that I want them as much as the field's going to have them. Bruno Caboclo and Chandler Parsons are more interesting plays to me at much less ownership, both guys under 10%. Caboclo had 40 minutes and 10 shots and put up 27.75 fantasy points in his last game. Parsons has been over 28 fantasy points in his last two. These two guys are going to get usage here, I think, without Conley. I think they're in a better spot here. Kola Vucevic right now looks like the most interesting and the highest owned Magic guy at a little under 20%. I'm okay with Vucevic here. He's the one I'd be the most comfortable with. Again, the Grizzlies are going to be a down pace spot, or at least should be. So it's a spot where you don't want a ton of guys, and Vucevic is probably the most reliable. Everyone else on the Magic looks fine here, but the pace, the Vegas total, those things all worry me enough. The fact too, the Magic have just been stomping every team who's bad, and the Grizzlies, who have now nobody of note, are going to be bad. So I would play the Magic players in a game stack in which you're saying this one stays close. Maybe the Grizzlies are a higher pace team without Conley. Maybe they get some scoring from those guys. That interests me a little, but otherwise I'm not trying to get a ton of Magic guys in there because there's really not much upside. The last corner I wanted to hit on, and you should also check the link in the description to see another game, the Heat and the Milwaukee Bucks. There's going to be another very, very highly owned guy I talk about, so click the link in the description and check that out now. But on to the rematch with the Thunder and the Raptors. This one is a 226-point combined total, which is flat for Toronto and represents a 2.4-point drop for Oklahoma City. Paul George only had 14 shots and 36.75 fantasy points in that last game versus the Raptors. It was a real mano-a-mano defensive battle with him and Kawhi Leonard, both guys really attacking each other like two alpha male defenders. So I think I could see Paul George having that same experience again. It's also possible it goes the other way, where these guys play a little looser, they know each other a little better, maybe they figure it out and counter move. So it could be a spot where Paul George is worth the slightly under 20% ownership currently projected for him. Russell Westbrook needed overtime to get there, but he's been over 66.75 fantasy points in 3 out of his last 4 games. The defense from Fred VanVleet, not something to worry about. The fact that Paul George may be bottled up by Kawhi Leonard definitely helps Westbrook, so it's a good spot for Russ to go back to. Jeremy Grant had a 30 fantasy point day. Despite 3 for 14 shooting, he was a big beneficiary of Paul George being bottled up, as was Dennis Schroeder, who picked up 16 shots last game. If Paul George falters, these guys will have bigger opportunity, so I'd have no problem playing these guys, especially Jeremy Grant, in lineups without Paul George. Kawhi Leonard didn't have a bad day, definitely a better one than Paul George with 48.5 fantasy points, but he was definitely getting attacked by Paul George. He shot just 8 for 19 on the day. So these guys defensively, if they're going at each other, locking horns like two Rams, it's going to be a tough spot. But if they do loosen up a little bit, Kawhi Leonard could be worth the 30% ownership expected for him right now. Fred VanVleet's been over 36 fantasy points in his 2 starts without Kyle Lowry since he returned from injury. So VanVleet looks good to me. I don't know that he's worth the 33% ownership expected for him right now. It seems a bit high given his sort of limited ceiling, but he looks good. He looks pretty steady, so I don't mind him here, even though I'd go a little bit beneath the field in case he does falter somehow. Pascal Siakam put up 63.75 fantasy points in that game versus the Thunder a few days ago. He put up 21 shots there, which ties a season high for him. Danny Green also benefited quite a bit, but again, I think this is a benefit that comes largely from Kawhi Leonard being bottled up and not taking all the usage he may have if he weren't being defended so ruggedly. So those guys could drop off a little bit if we do see Kawhi Leonard pick up a little more usage. I think there's risk, I think there's upside, and I'd prefer to take Siakam over Danny Green. Shocking, I know. So there we go. Those are my thoughts on today's slate, and as I mentioned, there are more in the link in the description down below, so click my column to the Switch and Hedge to read more details. So right now, like this video, leave a comment down below, tell me which guy you liked the most on today's slate. I may yell at you if it's Tyler Dorsey, but hey, go ahead, follow your heart, pick whoever you want, leave it in the comments down below, and I will jump in later to talk with you guys. And use the promo code Switch and Hedge, get half off your first month at Awesemo.com. All the ownership projections and rankings are right there for you from the top DFS player in the world, as well as projections from Josh Engelman, premium Slack where people are talking it up every day. You can just hop right in there, be one of the crew. So check that promo code again, and I'll be back again with you guys on Monday for another Four Corners video. So good luck, enjoy your weekend.